The air was cold enough to bite as I stepped out of the car and into the gray Edinburgh morning. A drizzle had settled over the cobblestones, giving the estate ahead a ghostly sheen. I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck, cursing my luck for another antiquing expedition in weather that felt more suited to grave robbing. Behind me, Isabella moved with that unnerving grace she always had, like the earth itself bent to her will. Her long coat and scarf gave her an air of mystery, ironic, considering she was the most dangerous thing in any room. "Remind me why we're here again?" I asked, trying not to shiver. Isabella's lips curled into a small smile. "Because you can't resist old junk, and I can't resist keeping you alive." Inside, the estate was alive with the hum of eager voices and the clinking of glassware. Tables sagged under the weight of forgotten treasures, candlesticks, faded paintings, ornate clocks, all the usual suspects. My eye roved over the clutter, looking for something with a story to tell. I found it on the edge of a table in the far corner, a key, small iron, and unremarkable at first glance. But as soon as I picked it up, a strange sensation crawled up my arm, like a static charge buzzing beneath my skin. The key was heavier than it looked, its surface etched with faint symbols that almost seemed to shift under the light. "Find something interesting?" Isabella's voice startled me. She was suddenly at my side, her sharp eyes locked on the key in my hand. "Just an old skeleton key," I said, trying to sound casual. "Probably came off a Victorian lockbox or something." Her hand darted out and gripped mine before I could turn it over. The cold of her touch sent a shiver up my spine. "Put it back, James." I laughed nervously. "What? It's just a... put it back." Her voice had dropped to a whisper, but it carried the weight of a command. Her dark eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. "That thing isn't just old, it's ancient, and it's dangerous." I should have listened. I really should have. But when a woman like Isabella tells you not to touch something, it only makes you want to hold on tighter. "What's it gonna do?" I asked, slipping it into my pocket. "Bite me?" Her sigh was low and exasperated. "One day, your curiosity is going to get you killed," I smirked. "Lucky for me, I've got a vampire to bail me out." The auctioneer's voice boomed from the other side of the room, breaking the tension. Isabella shot me a glare that promised retribution as she turned and drifted into the crowd. I stayed where I was, my hand brushing against the iron key in my pocket. It was cold to the touch, and yet, somehow, it burned. I had no idea what I'd just brought into my life, but I'd find out soon enough. The shop was quiet when we returned, the way it always was when dusk settled over Edinburgh. The faint hum of the city outside faded as I locked the door behind us. Inside, the scent of polished wood and aged paper greeted me like an old friend. Anderson's Antiques wasn't much to look at, but it was mine. Every shelf and display case held items with history, stories embedded in their very fibers. It was my lifeblood, my sanctuary, and now, perhaps, my greatest mistake. I set the day's acquisitions on the counter, the iron key resting on top of the pile. Its dull surface seemed to absorb the light, and for a moment, I swore the etchings shimmered. I blinked, and the illusion was gone. "Are you seriously keeping that thing?" Isabella's voice cut through the silence. She stood by the window, the dim light casting her features in sharp relief. "I told you it's trouble." I shrugged, unwrapping another item. "It's a key, Isabella. I'll clean it up, maybe figure out what it goes to. If it's worth anything, I'll sell it. If not, it goes in the back with the other curiosities." Her gaze didn't waver. "James, you don't even know what you're dealing with." "That's half the fun," I said, trying to keep my tone light, but her words lingered, unsettling in a way I couldn't quite shake. The hours slipped by as I cataloged the new items. Isabella disappeared upstairs, where she kept a private space that was as mysterious as she was. It wasn't until I started closing up for the night that I noticed something strange. The key was no longer on the counter. I frowned, glancing around. Maybe I'd moved it without thinking. I checked the shelves, the drawers beneath the counter, even the floor. Nothing. "Isabella?" I called, but there was no answer. My voice felt small against the shop's oppressive stillness. A soft clink drew my attention to the far corner of the room. I turned, my breath catching as I saw the iron key lying on the floor near the display case. I hadn't dropped it, had I? No, I was sure I'd left it on the counter. Cautiously, I crossed the room and picked it up. The metal was ice cold against my skin. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. This wasn't normal. James. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Isabella stood at the top of the staircase, her expression unreadable. You're staring at it like it's about to grow legs. It moved, I said, holding it up. I left it on the counter, and now, her lips pressed into a thin line. I told you, it's trouble. I didn't respond. Instead, I placed the key in a small wooden box and locked it, tucking it into the cabinet beneath the counter. For good measure, I pocketed the key to the cabinet. Whatever was going on, I wasn't going to let a lump of iron scare me. But as I switched off the lights and headed upstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that the iron key wasn't done with me yet. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The iron key weighed on my mind, its strange presence lingering like a shadow. Isabella had vanished to wherever she went when she wasn't keeping an eye on me, leaving the apartment above the shop eerily silent. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts circling back to the way the key had felt in my hand. Heavy, cold, alive. Was it just my imagination? Or was Isabella right about it being dangerous? A noise pulled me from my thoughts, a faint metallic scraping. I sat up, every nerve in my body on edge. The sound came again, this time louder, like nails dragging across metal. I crept out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise was coming from below, from the shop. The logical part of me wanted to believe it was just the old building settling, but logic felt distant and irrelevant in that moment. Grabbing a flashlight, I descended the narrow staircase, each creak of the wood sounding like a gunshot in the silence. The shop was dark, the shadows thick and oppressive. I swept the beam of light across the room, searching for the source of the noise. There it was, the wooden box on the counter, its lid ajar. My breath caught in my throat. I'd locked it. I was sure of it. The box creaked open wider as I approached, and the iron key slid out, clattering onto the counter. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The symbols etched into the key glowed faintly, casting an eerie light onto the surrounding surfaces. James. I spun around, the flashlight beam catching Isabella's pale face as she stepped out of the shadows. Her eyes were dark, her expression grim. I told you, trouble. I couldn't speak, my voice caught in my throat. The key pulsed once, and the room seemed to tilt, the air growing heavy and electric. We need to put it back, Isabella said, her tone urgent. Put it back where? I managed to choke out. She stepped closer, her gaze locked on the key. Wherever it came from. The iron key sat on the counter between us, its faint glow pulsing like a heartbeat. Isabella's gaze was fixed on it, her lips pressed into a thin line. I couldn't decide if she looked more curious or afraid. Knowing her, it was probably both. We need to put it back, she said again, her voice firmer this time. I ran a hand through my hair, still trying to steady my breathing. I don't even know where it came from. It was just sitting there at the estate sale like every other piece of junk. It's not junk, Isabella shot back. You know that now. I turned away, pacing the length of the shop. The faint hum of the key seemed to follow me, filling the silence. Maybe it belonged to my uncle, I muttered. He had a knack for collecting strange things. Isabella tilted her head. The one who left you the shop? I nodded, stopping in front of the large oak cabinet that housed my uncle's old ledgers and journals. He always said this place had secrets. He just never told me what they were. Isabella's eyes narrowed. Did he ever mention a key? No, I said, pulling open the cabinet door. But if anyone knew what this thing unlocks, it'd be him. The journals were exactly as I'd left them, stacked neatly in the bottom drawer. My uncle had kept meticulous records of every item that passed through the shop, each one cataloged with a description and sometimes a story. If the key had any history here, it would be in these pages. Isabella leaned over my shoulder as I flipped through the first journal, her cool presence unnervingly close. The faint scent of lavender and old parchment clung to her, a strange but not unpleasant combination. There, she said, pointing to an entry near the bottom of a page. I squinted at the faded ink. Iron key of unknown origin. Found in the shop basement during renovations, symbols appear alchemical in nature, possibly tied to the original foundation. My stomach turned. He found it here? Isabella straightened, her gaze scanning the shop as if seeing it for the first time. Looks like it never left. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. If it's tied to the foundation, that means... My voice trailed off as a horrible thought struck me. We need to check the basement. Isabella finished for me. The basement had always been my least favorite part of the shop. It was cold and damp, with a low ceiling that made even someone my height feel claustrophobic. My uncle had used it for storage, and I hadn't bothered to clear it out since taking over. Now, the flickering light from my flashlight made the shadows seem alive. Boxes and crates loomed around us, their contents long forgotten. Isabella moved ahead of me, her movements eerily fluid, her senses sharper than mine in the dark. What exactly are we looking for? I asked, trying to keep the nervous tremor out of my voice. Anything that looks wrong, Isabella said. Out of place. Ancient. Great, I muttered. That narrows it down. We searched in silence, the faint hum of the key still ringing in my ears. It wasn't until we reached the far wall that Isabella stopped, her hand brushing against the cold stone. Here, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I shone the flashlight where she was pointing. The stones were darker, almost black, and etched with symbols identical to the ones on the key. My heart sank. You've got to be kidding me. Isabella didn't answer. She reached out, her fingers tracing the symbols. The wall seemed to shudder beneath her touch, a low rumble vibrating through the floor. James, she said, turning to me, the key. I hesitated, my hand hovering over my pocket. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to lock the basement door, and pretend I'd never seen this. But the pull of the key was too strong. Reluctantly, I handed it to her. She took it with a strange reverence, turning it over in her hands. Then, without a word, she pressed it into a barely visible keyhole in the center of the wall. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the wall groaned, the sound deafening in the small space. The stones shifted, grinding against each other, as a doorway slowly opened, revealing a dark void beyond. I stared, unable to breathe. What the hell is that? Isabella didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the darkness, her expression unreadable. Something your uncle never wanted you to find. The air that spilled from beyond the doorway was cold, carrying the unmistakable scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and metallic. My flashlight beam barely penetrated the darkness, the light swallowed almost immediately. Ladies first, I muttered, my voice shaky. Isabella shot me a look, her lips curling into a faint smirk. You're the mortal. If something down there kills you, at least I can carry you out. Comforting, I said, stepping into the void. The floor beneath my feet was uneven stone, slick with moisture. The walls were closer than I'd expected, carved roughly out of rock. This wasn't part of the original shop foundation. This was something else entirely. Isabella followed close behind, her footsteps silent. The door ground shut behind us, and I resisted the urge to panic. The key still hummed in her hand, its faint glow casting strange shadows on the walls. This isn't right, I said, my voice low. This doesn't feel like it belongs here, Isabella finished. It doesn't. This is older than your shop, older than Edinburgh. My breath hitched. How do you know that? I can feel it, she said simply. This place, it's wrong. The passage opened into a circular chamber, its walls lined with shelves carved directly into the stone. Ancient artifacts sat on the shelves, covered in dust and cobwebs. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it lay a journal bound in cracked leather. This looks familiar, I said, stepping closer. It should, Isabella replied. Your uncle left it here. I turned to her, my brow furrowing. How could you possibly know that? Her expression was grim, because I was here when he did. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, trying to make sense of what she just said. You knew my uncle? Isabella nodded, her gaze distant. I met him decades ago, long before you inherited this place. He was curious, like you, too curious. Why didn't you tell me? My voice was rising, anger creeping into it. Because I didn't think you'd stumble onto this, she said, gesturing to the room. Your uncle swore to keep it sealed. He knew what was at stake. And now it's my problem, I said bitterly. Thanks for the warning. She didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the journal. With a sigh, I stepped forward and picked it up, the leather rough and brittle beneath my fingers. I opened it carefully, the pages filled with my uncle's familiar scrawl. The entries were fragmented, as though written in haste. Words like dimensional crossroads and sealed gateway jumped out at me, sending chills down my spine. One passage in particular caught my attention. The key is both the lock and the door. It must never be used, for what lies beyond is not meant for this world. I looked up at Isabella. What the hell was my uncle into? She hesitated, then said, something he shouldn't have been. The hum of the key grew louder, and the room seemed to pulse with it. The air grew heavy, and the light from the key intensified, casting the chamber in an eerie glow. The artifacts on the shelves rattled, a low vibration shaking the ground. We need to leave, Isabella said, urgency in her voice. But before we could move, the glow from the key flared, and the walls of the chamber seemed to ripple like water. A deep, resonant sound filled the air, like a massive bell tolling in the distance. What's happening? I shouted, clutching the journal to my chest. Isabella grabbed my arm, her grip iron strong. The gate is opening. The center of the room began to shift, the stone pedestal sinking into the floor. In its place, a swirling void of black and green energy appeared, crackling with lightning. The vibration intensified, and the sound of whispers filled the air, 1,000 voices speaking all at once. Close it, I yelled. How do we close it? Isabella's eyes darted around the room. The key. We have to use the key to seal it again. I turned to the void, my heart racing. The journal had mentioned something about a ritual, but I hadn't had time to read it. What do I do? Trust me, Isabella said, holding out her hand. Give me the key. Every instinct screamed at me not to. The key was dangerous, I knew that much. But Isabella had saved my life more times than I could count, and if anyone knew how to handle this, it was her. I handed her the key. She stepped forward, her movements deliberate. The void seemed to react to her presence, the energy shifting and coiling like a living thing. She raised the key, its glow blinding now, and spoke words I didn't understand. Ancient, guttural sounds that sent shivers down my spine. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. The ground beneath us cracked, and I stumbled, clutching the journal like a lifeline. Isabella pressed the key into the center of the void, and for a moment, everything froze. Then, with a deafening roar, the void collapsed in on itself, the energy imploding with a blinding flash of light. The force knocked me off my feet, and I hit the ground hard, my vision swimming. When I opened my eyes, the chamber was silent. The void was gone, the key lying on the floor, inert. Isabella stood over it, her shoulders slumped, her breathing heavy. It's done, she said, her voice barely audible. The silence in the chamber was suffocating, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. The key lay on the floor, dull and lifeless, its once glowing symbols now faint and cold. Isabella knelt beside it, her pale hand hovering over the metal as if she were afraid to touch it. What? What the hell was that? My voice was shaky, the words barely finding their way out. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she picked up the key, studying it with a mixture of wariness and relief. A gate, she said finally. To somewhere we're not meant to go. Not meant to go? I repeated, rising unsteadily to my feet. Is that your professional assessment, or just another cryptic warning? Her dark eyes flashed. Do you want the long version? Because I can explain how dimensional rifts work if that'll make you feel better. I waved a hand, cutting her off. Forget it. Just tell me it's closed for good. She hesitated, and that hesitation was all the answer I needed. It's sealed, she said. For now, but gates like this, they don't just disappear. Your uncle knew that. I frowned, clutching the journal tighter. What did he know, Isabella? What aren't you telling me? She looked away, her expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. He was trying to protect you, to protect this city, maybe even more than that. The weight of her words sank in slowly. My uncle had always been a mystery, even when he was alive. He'd loved this shop, loved its history, but he'd never let me in on the deeper secrets. And now those secrets were mine, whether I wanted them or not. We left the chamber in silence, the hidden door grinding shut behind us. I carried the journal, while Isabella kept the key, her grip on it tight as if she didn't trust me not to do something stupid. Back in the shop, the air felt different, heavier. The artifacts seemed to hum faintly, like they were reacting to something unseen. Do you feel that? I asked, glancing at Isabella. She nodded, her expression grim. The gate might be sealed, but it wasn't clean. Something came through. My stomach dropped. Something? Like what? She moved to the nearest shelf, her hand hovering over an old brass sextant. The metal vibrated slightly, an unnatural energy radiating from it. Residual energy, she said. But it's not just lingering, it's spreading. I watched as she turned, scanning the shop with a sharpness I'd only seen when she was hunting. Is it dangerous? I asked. Not yet, she said, but if we don't contain it. She didn't need to finish the sentence. I could already picture the chaos. Objects coming to life, customers getting more than they bargained for. The shop had always been a place of mystery, but now it felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Later that evening, as I tried to piece together the fragments of my uncle's journal, a knock at the shop door startled me. It was late, far too late for customers. Isabella had retreated to her upstairs room, leaving me alone with the uneasy quiet. I approached the door cautiously, the journal still in my hands. Through the frosted glass, I could make out a figure, tall and cloaked. Something about their silhouette set me on edge. "We're closed," I called out. The figure didn't move. They simply stood there, silent and unmoving. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and opened it a crack. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice firm. The figure stepped forward, and I caught a glimpse of their face. A man, gaunt and pale, with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. "You have something that doesn't belong to you," he said, his voice low and hollow. My grip tightened on the journal. "I don't know what you're talking about." He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that made my skin crawl. "Oh, I think you do. The key, it's not yours to keep." Panic flared in my chest. "Who are you?" The man's smile widened. "Someone who knows what happens when the wrong people meddle with the wrong things." Before I could respond, Isabella appeared at my side, her eyes flashing dangerously. "Leave," she said, her voice cold as ice. The man didn't flinch. If anything, his smile grew darker. "You can't protect him forever," he said, his gaze locking onto mine. "The gate isn't the only one." With that, he turned and disappeared into the night, leaving me with more questions than answers. After the encounter, Isabella and I sat in the shop, the tension thick in the air. She was the first to speak. "That man wasn't human," she said. "No kidding," I replied, running a hand through my hair. "What does he mean? The gate isn't the only one." She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was quiet. "Your uncle wasn't just protecting this shop. He was guarding something much bigger, and now, so are you." The weight of her words settled heavily on my shoulders. The shop, the key, the journal, none of it was just mine anymore. It was a responsibility, one I hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. "I'm going to figure this out," I said, more to myself than to her. "Whatever my uncle started, I'll finish it." Isabella's expression softened, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of pride. "Good," she said, "because you're going to need me." The shop felt more alive than ever, and not in a good way. Objects on the shelves seemed to hum faintly, and shadows danced where there shouldn't have been any. Even the air had a weight to it, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. I sat at the counter with my uncle's journal and the shop's oldest ledger spread out before me. Isabella leaned against a nearby display case, her arms crossed, watching me with that unshakable calm she always had. "What exactly are you hoping to find in there?" she asked. "Answers," I said without looking up. If my uncle knew about the gate, maybe he left something behind to deal with it. A clue, a map, anything. Or, Isabella said, he didn't because he never intended for you to open it. I shot her a look. Not helping. The ledger was a mess of cramped handwriting, inventory lists, and occasional notes about particularly strange or valuable items. My uncle had always been meticulous, but as I flipped through the pages, a pattern began to emerge. Certain items were marked with a small symbol, a circle bisected by a jagged line. "Look at this," I said, pointing to one of the entries. He marked specific items, like this one, iron key, unknown origin, same symbol. Isabella leaned in, her sharp eyes scanning the page. "He must have been tracking things tied to the gate," I nodded. "And it's not just the key, there are others, a mirror, a clock, a ring, all marked with the same symbol." "Do you have those items here?" Isabella asked. "Some of them," I said. "The mirror's in the back room. The clock was sold years ago, and the ring." My voice trailed off as I scanned the list. "I don't know where the ring is. It's not in the shop inventory anymore." Isabella straightened, her expression grim. "If the key caused this much trouble, imagine what the others could do." We retrieved the mirror from the back room, a large ornate piece framed in black and silver. Its surface was tarnished and cloudy, but as I set it on the counter, a strange sensation washed over me. It felt as if the mirror was watching me. "Lovely," I muttered, because one cursed object wasn't enough. Isabella didn't respond. She was already examining the mirror, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings on the frame. "There's something here," she said, her voice distant. "Something alive." "Alive," I repeated, stepping back. "What does that mean?" Before she could answer, the surface of the mirror rippled like water, and an image began to form. It wasn't a reflection. It was a place, a dark forest, shrouded in mist, with faint, glowing lights flickering in the distance. "That's not Edinburgh," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "No," Isabella agreed, "it's not." The glowing lights in the mirror grew brighter, moving closer. Shadows shifted in the mist, vague shapes that sent a chill down my spine. One of the lights broke free, darting toward the edge of the mirror, and for a terrifying moment, I thought it was going to come through. "Close it," I shouted. Isabella grabbed the key, pressing it against the mirror's frame. The symbols on the key flared to life, and with a shuddering groan, the mirror's surface went still. The glowing lights vanished, leaving only our pale reflections. "That," I said, "was way too close." Isabella set the key down, her expression hard. "If these objects are tied to the gate, we need to find the rest of them, fast." We worked late into the night, combing through the ledger and inventory records to track down the remaining marked items. The clock was a dead end, sold at an estate auction years ago. The ring, however, had a more recent trail. "It was consigned to a collector downtown," I said, reading from an old receipt. "Name's Archibald Kane." Isabella arched an eyebrow. "And do you think Mr. Kane will just hand it over if we explain it's cursed?" I rubbed my temples. "Probably not, but if the ring's causing any problems, he might be willing to listen." The doorbell jingled, cutting off our conversation. My head snapped up and my blood ran cold as I saw the same man from earlier, the one who had warned us about the key, standing just inside the shop. "You're persistent," Isabella said, stepping between me and the stranger. He ignored her, his glowing eyes fixed on me. "You've opened a door you can't close," he said, "and now you're trying to play cleanup. Admirable, but pointless." I gritted my teeth. "What do you want?" "To warn you," he said. "The key was only the beginning. If you keep meddling, you'll awaken things far worse than what you've already seen." Isabella moved faster than I could track, crossing the space between them in an instant. Her hand shot out, grabbing the man by the collar. "We don't need your warnings," she hissed. "If you know something, spill it. Otherwise, get out." The man didn't flinch, his eerie calm unbroken. "You'll see soon enough," he said, "when the others come for you." Isabella released him, shoving him backward. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the night, leaving an icy silence in his wake. Morning broke reluctantly over Edinburgh, gray light filtering through the shop's front windows. I hadn't slept, and judging by Isabella's silence, neither had she. The words of our strange visitor echoed in my mind. The key was only the beginning. Our next move was clear. The ledger had led us to Archibald Kane, a collector downtown who'd purchased the ring years ago. If it was connected to the gate, and I was sure it was, it couldn't stay in his possession. "Are you ready?" Isabella asked, her tone unusually sharp. She stood by the door, coat already on, the iron key tucked into her pocket. "As ready as I'll ever be," I said, grabbing my scarf. The journal was in my bag, along with the old receipt for the ring. I wasn't sure how much help it would be, but it felt better to have something to hold on to. We arrived at Kane's townhouse in the heart of the city, its imposing stone facade as cold as the man who answered the door. Archibald Kane was tall and wiry, with silver hair and a face that seemed carved from granite. His sharp eyes narrowed as he looked us over. "I don't take visitors without appointments," he said curtly. "This won't take long," I said, pulling the receipt from my bag. "We're here about the ring." His expression darkened, and he started to close the door. Isabella's hand shot out, stopping it with ease. "The ring," she said, her voice low and commanding. "Where is it?" Kane hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie," I said, stepping forward. "You bought it from my uncle's shop years ago. It's in your records, and we need it back." Kane's jaw tightened. That ring is dangerous. I exchanged a glance with Isabella. You know what it is? He sighed, his shoulders slumping. It's cursed, or something close to it. I put it in the vault years ago and haven't touched it since. Show us, Isabella said. Kane led us down a narrow staircase to the basement of his townhouse. The walls were lined with shelves, each one crammed with strange and beautiful artifacts. At the far end of the room stood a heavy steel door with an intricate locking mechanism. He unlocked it with a series of keys and gestures, the metal door swinging open to reveal a smaller room lined with glass cases. In the center, sitting on a black velvet cushion, was the ring. It was simple at first glance, a band of dark metal set with a single red stone. But as I stepped closer, I felt a familiar hum, like the one from the iron key. The symbols etched into the band glowed faintly, the same jagged design as the key. Don't touch it, Kane warned, his voice tight. I don't know what it does, but the last time I held it, I couldn't sleep for days. It's like it gets into your head. Perfect, I muttered. Just what we needed. Isabella ignored his warning, plucking the ring from its cushion. She held it up to the light, her expression unreadable. It's tied to the gate, she said. Like the key. It's another seal, or maybe a piece of the lock. And now what? Kane asked. If you're planning to take it, be my guest. It's been nothing but trouble. I hesitated, my mind racing. If the key and the ring were part of some larger mechanism, we couldn't leave it here. But taking it felt like inviting more danger. We'll take it, Isabella said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Kane looked relieved as he handed over the small box he'd kept the ring in. Whatever happens, he said, don't bring it back here. We left Kane's townhouse with the ring securely in Isabella's possession. The air felt heavier as we walked through the city, as if the ring's presence was drawing something closer. Isabella was quiet, her eyes scanning every shadow. When we returned to the shop, I could tell immediately that something was wrong. The door was ajar, the lock twisted and broken. Stay here, Isabella said, stepping inside without waiting for my reply. Like hell, I'm staying out here, I muttered, following her in. The shop was a mess. Shelves were overturned, artifacts scattered across the floor. The mirror we'd sealed earlier was shattered, its fragments glittering like ice in the dim light. But the worst part was the figure standing at the counter. It was the man from before, or something that looked like him. His features were sharper now, almost inhuman, and his glowing eyes burned like embers. You're persistent, Isabella said, her voice low and dangerous. He smiled, his teeth unnaturally sharp. And you're in over your heads. The gate may be sealed, but the damage is done. They're coming. Who's coming? I demanded, stepping forward despite every instinct telling me to stay back. His smile widened. The ones who built it, the ones who left it behind, and they're not happy you've disturbed their work. Before either of us could react, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving only his chilling laughter behind. The man's laughter lingered long after he vanished, a haunting echo that seemed to seep into the walls of the shop. Isabella and I stood in silence, the weight of his words pressing down like a heavy fog. They're coming, I repeated, the words barely audible. Who the hell is he talking about? Isabella didn't answer right away. She crouched beside one of the overturned shelves, her fingers tracing a shattered piece of the mirror. Her expression was grim. The ones who built the gate, she said finally, the ones who created the seals. You mean whoever, or whatever, locked it in the first place? She nodded. If they're coming, it means they've noticed the disruption, and they're not going to stop until it's fixed. Fixed, I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think they'll just tidy up the shop and leave us alone? No, Isabella said quietly. They'll destroy everything connected to the gate, including us. I sank into a chair, my hands trembling. The journal sat on the counter, its pages filled with my uncle's frantic scrawl. He'd known this was coming. He'd spent years preparing, and now it was up to me to finish what he'd started. What do we do? I asked, looking up at Isabella. She stood, her movements fluid and deliberate. We fight. The next few hours were a blur of frantic preparation. Isabella pored over my uncle's journal, piecing together fragments of rituals and protective wards. I searched the shop for anything that could help. Salt, candles, ancient relics imbued with protective energy. The shop itself felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. "This won't be enough," Isabella said, her voice sharp as she snapped the journal shut. "We're working with fragments. Your uncle didn't leave the full ritual." "Then what's the plan?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. She looked at me, her dark eyes steady. "We use the ring and the key to stabilize the gate. If we can reinforce the seal, it might hold long enough to keep them out. And if it doesn't?" Her silence was answer enough. We worked in the basement, the air thick with tension. The hidden door to the chamber remained closed, but the energy emanating from it was stronger than ever. The key and the ring pulsed faintly in Isabella's hands, their light growing brighter as we approached the center of the room. "This is where it started," she said, setting the key and the ring on the pedestal. "And this is where it ends." As we began the ritual, the air in the chamber grew heavy, charged with a static energy that made my skin crawl. Isabella chanted in a language I didn't recognize, her voice low and rhythmic. The symbols on the key and the ring flared to life, casting strange shadows on the walls. For a moment, it seemed to be working. The energy around us shifted, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. But then, the ground beneath us trembled, and a deep, resonant sound echoed through the chamber. "They're here," Isabella said, her voice tight. The shadows in the room began to move, coalescing into tall, humanoid figures. Their forms were indistinct, their features blurred like smudges of ink on paper. But their presence was unmistakable, cold, ancient, and impossibly powerful. "Keep going," Isabella shouted, her hands glowing as she poured her energy into the ritual. I tried to focus, my hands shaking as I held the journal open. The words blurred together, and the room seemed to spin. One of the figures stepped forward, its shadowy form towering over me. "Mortals," it said, its voice like grinding stone. "You have tampered with forces beyond your comprehension." "Yeah, well," I stammered, "it's kind of a family tradition." The figure didn't respond, but its presence pressed down on me, suffocating. Isabella's voice rose, her chant growing louder and more desperate. The symbols on the pedestal flared, and the figures recoiled slightly, their forms flickering. "It's working," I shouted. "For now," Isabella said through gritted teeth. "But it's not enough." The energy in the room reached a crescendo, the light from the key and the ring blinding. Isabella turned to me, her expression fierce. "Take the key," she said, shoving it into my hands. "What? Why?" "You're the one who inherited this mess," she said. "You have to finish it." I hesitated, the weight of the key like a lead weight in my palm. "I don't know how." "Yes, you do," she said, her voice steady. "Your uncle left you everything you need. Trust yourself." The shadows surged toward us, their forms twisting and contorting. My heart pounded as I raised the key, the glowing symbols burning into my vision. The words from the journal came unbidden, spilling from my lips in a voice that didn't feel like my own. The light from the key and the ring combined, erupting in a brilliant flash. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into the air. The ground beneath us shook violently, and then, with a deafening crack, the energy in the room imploded. When the dust settled, the chamber was silent. The key and the ring lay on the pedestal, their light dim and steady. Isabella stood beside me, her expression unreadable. "It's done," she said. "For now," I replied, the weight of her earlier warning settling in. "But what happens when they come back?" She gave me a faint smile. "Then we'll be ready." The shop felt different after the ritual. The air was lighter, and the hum that had haunted me since the key's arrival was gone. But the weight in my chest remained. The iron key and the ring now sat locked in a reinforced case beneath the counter. For now, they were inert, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for something or someone. Isabella stood by the window, watching the rain drizzle down the cobblestones outside. She'd been quiet since we returned from the chamber, her usual sharpness tempered by an uncharacteristic calm. "You don't think it's over?" I said, breaking the silence. "It's never over," she replied, turning to face me. "But you've bought us time. That's more than most would have managed." I leaned against the counter, my gaze drifting to the locked case. My uncle must have known this would happen. He tried to prepare me, but I don't think I'll ever be ready. She crossed the room, her footsteps silent, and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Readiness isn't the point, James. It's about doing what needs to be done, whether you're ready or not." Her words were cold comfort, but they rang true. The journal sat open on the counter beside me, its pages filled with half-finished rituals and cryptic warnings. My uncle had dedicated his life to protecting this place, and now that responsibility was mine. "What about the others?" I asked, flipping through the ledger. "The artifacts we haven't found yet? The ones that might still be out there?" Isabella's eyes darkened. "We'll find them, before someone else does." A soft chime broke the tension, the shop's doorbell. I straightened, instinctively slipping the journal out of sight. Isabella stepped back into the shadows, her presence vanishing like smoke. The door creaked open, and a man stepped inside, his umbrella dripping onto the worn floorboards. He looked around, his sharp eyes taking in the shelves of artifacts. "Are you James Anderson?" he asked, his voice clipped and precise. "That's me," I said, forcing a smile. "Can I help you?" He reached into his coat, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "I was told you're the one to speak to about unusual items." I took the paper, unfolding it carefully. It was a sketch, an old ornate compass with strange symbols etched into its surface. My stomach tightened as I recognized the design. "Where did you get this?" I asked. The man smiled faintly. "Let's just say it found me. Interested?" I glanced at Isabella, who watched from the shadows with a knowing look. The compass was another piece of the puzzle, another key to the mystery my uncle had left behind. I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. "Yeah," I said, "I'm interested." As the man began explaining its origins, I felt a strange sense of calm. The shop had been my uncle's legacy, and now it was mine. Whatever came through its doors, I'd face it, with Isabella at my side and my uncle's lessons guiding me. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside the shop, the storm had just begun. Thank you for tuning into my story. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to like the video. It helps support my channel and allows me to keep creating more content for you. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to comment below and share your favorite part of the story or any theories you might have. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads. Your support means the world to me. And I'm excited to bring you even more thrilling stories.